The fields of Gettysburg are serene now, nestled in the quiet countryside of Pennsylvania, a patchwork of rolling hills and tranquil farms. But in July of 1863, this ground was anything but peaceful. The Battle of Gettysburg, one of the most pivotal and bloodiest clashes of the American Civil War, left an indelible scar on the land and the souls of those who fought there. Over 3 days of intense combat, nearly 50,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing, their blood soaking the earth, their cries of anguish and fury echoing across the hills. This wasn't just a battle, it was a turning point in the war. The Union Army, under the command of General George Meade, clashed with General Robert E. Lee's Confederate forces in a desperate struggle for dominance. Victory for the Union solidified the Northern cause, while defeat pushed the South into a slow, agonizing retreat. But it wasn't just the living who paid the price for this decisive moment. The souls of those who fell on that battlefield seem to have never truly left. The ghost stories surrounding Gettysburg are legendary. The fog that blankets the field in the early morning hours has been said to hide more than just memories. It harbors spirits, lingering remnants of the past, forever replaying the horrors of those 3 days in 1863. Soldiers from both sides are seen walking the battlefield, their spectral forms locked in endless combat, unable to rest. The land itself breathes with an eerie silence, as if the earth remembers the blood spilled upon it and the screams that once shattered the air. As night falls, the battlefield takes on a different life, one not seen by human eyes but felt in the soul. There are those who claim to have seen more than shadows among the ruins and the rolling hills, and those brave enough to visit after dark often come back with stories that chill the bone. Allow me to tell you a few of these stories, tales passed down by those who have walked the battlefield at night, who have felt the cold touch of the past, and who will never forget what they encountered. The air was thick with mist that evening, the kind of fog that creeps in from the hills and blankets the world in a soft, suffocating gray. The sun was setting slowly over the Pennsylvania countryside, casting long shadows over the quiet fields and groves that stretched for miles in every direction. But this wasn't just any field. This was Gettysburg, the site of one of the bloodiest battles in American history. And as I walked the quiet paths that crisscrossed the battlefield, I couldn't help but feel the weight of that history pressing down on me. The Battle of Gettysburg was fought in July of 1863, a turning point in the American Civil War. Over 3 days of savage fighting, nearly 50,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing. It was a victory for the Union Army, but the cost was almost unimaginable. The fields were soaked with blood, the air thick with the cries of dying men. And even though more than a century and a half had passed since that fateful battle, the scars remained, not just in the monuments and the cannons that dotted the landscape, but in something deeper, something that couldn't be seen, but could certainly be felt. That's what brought me here tonight. I had heard the stories. Of course, anyone who has even a passing interest in the paranormal knows that Gettysburg is said to be one of the most haunted places in America. Soldiers' spirits, trapped by the violence of their deaths, are said to wander the battlefield, replaying their final moments over and over again. Ghostly apparitions have been spotted, strange sounds have been heard, and an overwhelming sense of dread seems to hang in the air after dark. But there was one story in particular that had always fascinated me, the story of the Phantom Brigade. I first heard it from Daniel, a park ranger who had worked at Gettysburg for nearly a decade. We met by chance during one of my visits to the battlefield a few years ago. Daniel was a quiet, reserved man, not prone to telling tall tales or exaggerating for the sake of a good story. But when I asked him if he had ever experienced anything unusual during his time at Gettysburg, his demeanor changed. His eyes darkened, and a shadow seemed to pass over his face. "Have you ever heard about the Phantom Brigade?" he asked me, his voice barely more than a whisper. I hadn't, so I urged him to tell me more. It was late in the autumn of 2010, Daniel began, when he first saw them. The battlefield was quiet that evening, with only a handful of tourists wandering the grounds. The weather had turned chilly, and most people had retreated to the warmth of their cars or nearby restaurants. Daniel was on his usual patrol, driving slowly along the dirt paths that wound through the western edge of the battlefield, near a place known as the wheat field. The wheat field was one of the bloodiest areas of the battle, Daniel explained. On July 2, 1863, Union and Confederate forces clashed in a fierce, close-quarters fight that lasted for hours. The ground was littered with bodies by the end of the day, and the Union's eventual victory came at a heavy cost. It's said that over 6,000 men died in that field alone, their blood soaking into the soil, staining it forever. Daniel had driven through the area countless times, both during the day and at night, and while he had always been aware of the battlefield's tragic history, he had never experienced anything out of the ordinary, until that night. As he rounded a bend in the path, his headlights caught something strange in the distance. At first, he thought it was just the fog playing tricks on his eyes, shapes moving in the mist, shifting and swirling like shadows. But as he drew closer, he realized that what he was seeing was not a trick of the light. Marching toward him, emerging from the fog, was a line of soldiers. "I thought it was a reenactment at first," Daniel said, leaning forward in his chair as he recounted the story. "We get those sometimes, especially around the anniversary of the battle. But something was off. They weren't carrying lanterns or flashlights, and they weren't making any noise, not even the sound of their boots on the ground." Daniel slowed his truck to a crawl, watching in disbelief as the soldiers marched straight toward him. They moved in perfect formation, their rifles slung over their shoulders, their heads bowed slightly as though they were lost in thought or perhaps in exhaustion. Their uniforms were ragged, torn in places, and stained with dirt and what looked like blood. Some of them wore bandages around their heads or arms, and others limped as they walked, their legs stiff and unsteady. But the most unsettling thing, Daniel said, was their faces. They looked hollow, he explained, struggling to find the right words. Like they weren't really there. Their eyes were dark, sunken, like they hadn't slept in days or years, and their skin was pale, almost translucent. But they didn't seem to notice me at all. They just kept walking. The brigade passed by his truck in eerie silence, their faces never turning to acknowledge him, their feet moving in a steady, almost mechanical rhythm. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine as they marched past, their forms gradually fading back into the mist as they continued on their ghostly path. Shaken, Daniel radioed back to the main office, but no one else had reported seeing anything unusual. He spent the rest of his shift in uneasy silence, unable to shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something beyond explanation. For weeks after the encounter, Daniel kept the story to himself, unsure of what to make of it. He wasn't a superstitious man, and he had always been skeptical of ghost stories. But what he had seen that night was no illusion. It was real, or at least, it felt real. But that wasn't the last time Daniel saw the Phantom Brigade. A few months later, in early spring, Daniel had another run-in with the ghostly soldiers. It was a calm, clear night, and the battlefield was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. Once again, Daniel was patrolling the area near the wheat field, his truck moving slowly along the narrow path, when he saw them again. This time they were further away, near the tree line at the edge of the field. But there was no mist to obscure them, no fog to blame for the strange sight. The soldiers were there, as clear as day, their forms illuminated by the moonlight. Daniel stopped his truck and got out, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the soldiers march across the field. They moved in the same slow, steady rhythm as before, their faces expressionless, their eyes hollow and dark. But this time, something was different. One of the soldiers broke formation. At first, Daniel thought he was imagining it. The soldier, who had been marching in line with the others, suddenly veered off to the side, his steps faltering as he stumbled toward the edge of the field. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as though he were struggling to maintain control of his body. Daniel watched, frozen in place, as the soldier fell to his knees, his hands clutching his chest as though in pain. For a moment, Daniel considered running to help him, but then he remembered that this wasn't a living person he was watching. This was something else, something not of this world. The soldier remained on his knees for several minutes, his head bowed, his body trembling. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the episode was over. The soldier stood up, his movements once again smooth and mechanical, and rejoined the brigade without a word. They continued their march, disappearing into the trees at the far end of the field. Daniel stood there for what felt like hours, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he had just seen. He had heard stories of ghosts repeating the same actions over and over, trapped in a loop of their final moments, but this was different. It was as though the soldier had broken free from that loop, if only for a moment, and had experienced something real, something human. After his second encounter with the Phantom Brigade, Daniel began researching the history of the battle more closely, hoping to find some explanation for what he had seen. He spent hours poring over old documents, reading accounts from soldiers who had fought in the wheat field, trying to piece together the story of the men who had died there. What he found was both fascinating and horrifying. The wheat field had been the site of some of the most intense fighting during the battle, with Union and Confederate forces clashing in brutal, close-quarters combat. The fighting had raged for hours, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. By the end of the day, the field was littered with bodies, and the ground was so saturated with blood that it had turned into a muddy, gruesome quagmire. Many of the soldiers who died in the wheat field were never properly buried. Their bodies were left to decompose in the open air, their bones eventually scattered by the wind and the elements. Some say that the souls of those soldiers never found peace, and that they continue to wander the battlefield, searching for something they lost in the chaos of battle. The Phantom Brigade, Daniel theorized, could be one of those lost groups of soldiers. Perhaps they were a unit that had been cut off from the rest of the army, marching aimlessly through the fog of war, unaware that their fight had ended long ago. But the question remained, why had they appeared to him? What had caused the soldier to break formation, to show that brief moment of human vulnerability before returning to his ghostly march? Daniel didn't have an answer, and as much as he tried to rationalize the experience, to convince himself that it was just a trick of the light or a vivid dream, he knew deep down that what he had seen was real. The Phantom Brigade was real, and they were still out there, somewhere in the fog, marching toward a battle that would never end. Daniel's third and final encounter with the Phantom Brigade came on a stormy night in late summer. The sky was dark with thunderclouds, and the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of the Rangers' station. Most of the staff had gone home for the night, but Daniel was still there, finishing up some paperwork before heading out for his final patrol. As the storm intensified, Daniel felt a strange sense of unease settle over him. It was the same feeling he had experienced before, an inexplicable heaviness in the air, as though something was watching him. He tried to ignore it, focusing on his work, but the feeling only grew stronger. Finally, unable to shake the sense of dread, Daniel grabbed his flashlight and headed out into the night. The rain was coming down in sheets, soaking him to the bone as he made his way across the battlefield. The wind whipped through the trees, and the distant rumble of thunder echoed across the hills. Daniel walked quickly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. And then he saw them. The Phantom Brigade was there, marching through the rain, their ghostly forms barely visible in the downpour. They moved in the same steady rhythm as before, their faces blank and emotionless, their eyes dark and hollow. But this time, Daniel wasn't afraid. He had seen them before, and he knew what to expect, or so he thought. As he watched, one of the soldiers, possibly the same one he had seen stumble before, broke formation again. This time, however, the soldier didn't stop at the edge of the field. He kept walking, moving toward Daniel with slow, deliberate steps. Daniel's heart raced as the soldier drew closer. His instinct was to run, but his legs refused to move. He stood frozen in place, watching in horror as the soldier approached, his face becoming clearer with each step. The soldier's eyes were dark, empty voids, his skin pale and gaunt. His uniform was tattered, soaked with rain, and his hands trembled as he reached out toward Daniel. For a moment, Daniel thought the soldier was going to touch him. He could feel the cold air radiating off the ghostly figure, could hear the faint, labored breathing of a man long dead. And then, just as the soldier's hand was about to make contact, he disappeared. Daniel stood there, drenched and shivering, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around, but the Phantom Brigade was gone, swallowed by the storm. It was over. Daniel never saw the Phantom Brigade again after that night, but the memory of those encounters stayed with him. He continued to work at Gettysburg for several more years, but he was always cautious when patrolling the wheat field, always aware of the possibility that the ghostly soldiers might return. When he finally retired, he shared his story with me, passing on the legend of the Phantom Brigade, as if entrusting me with a secret too heavy to bear alone. I've walked those same paths, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ghostly soldiers, but I've never been as fortunate or as cursed as Daniel. Still, every time I visit Gettysburg, I can feel them. The air grows cold, the wind whispers through the trees, and I know that somewhere, out there in the mist, the Phantom Brigade is still marching, forever lost in a battle that has no end. It was a brisk autumn afternoon when I first met Margaret. A seasoned local historian with decades of research under her belt, Margaret had become a fixture of the Gettysburg community. Her passion for the history of the battle was rivaled only by her deep fascination with the hauntings that surrounded it. Over coffee at a small cafe in the heart of town, she shared with me one of the most chilling stories I had ever heard, the story of the woman in white. There had always been something ethereal about the ghost stories tied to Gettysburg, but Margaret's tale carried a weight of sorrow and loss that made it stand out. Unlike the soldier apparitions that seemed bound by the chaos of battle, this haunting was much more personal. The woman in white wasn't a soldier, but rather a caretaker of those who had been wounded. Her story was one of devotion turned to despair, a tragedy wrapped in the endless grief of the dead. The woman in white, Margaret explained, is often seen near the old Lutheran Theological Seminary, now part of the Gettysburg College campus. The building had been commandeered as a hospital during the battle, and its stone walls witnessed some of the most horrific scenes of the war. The cries of the wounded, the frantic work of the surgeons, the blood-soaked floors. It was a place steeped in death. And it was here, according to legend, that the woman in white had first appeared. Her story, Margaret told me, begins during the days of the battle itself. While many local women volunteered as nurses to aid the Union soldiers, there was one in particular whose identity remains shrouded in mystery. She was described as young, no more than in her early 20s, and she wore a simple white dress, likely a makeshift uniform, as was common among the volunteer nurses of the time. She had no formal training, yet worked tirelessly, tending to the wounded with a quiet determination that quickly earned her the admiration of both soldiers and surgeons alike. But the horrors she witnessed inside the makeshift hospital soon took their toll. Day after day, she saw men suffer unspeakable injuries, their bodies mangled by gunfire and cannon blasts. Many of them died in her arms, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't save them. It was said that she would often disappear for long stretches of time, only to be found sitting alone in the hospital's chapel, her hands clasped in silent prayer, tears streaming down her face. As the battle raged on, the casualties mounted, and the hospital became a place of overwhelming sorrow. The surgeons worked around the clock, amputating limbs and patching wounds, but it was never enough. The woman's grief deepened with each passing day, until finally, she vanished altogether. Some said she had fled the horrors of the battlefield, unable to bear the weight of so much death. Others believed she had died of exhaustion or heartbreak, her body lost among the many who had perished in those brutal days. But the truth, as Margaret told me, is far stranger and far more terrifying. The woman in white didn't simply disappear. She became something more, something eternal. Her first appearance as a ghost was reported just weeks after the battle had ended. Several soldiers, who had returned to the seminary to recover from their wounds, claimed to have seen her walking the halls late at night. At first, they assumed she was another nurse, her pale figure moving quietly among the wounded. But as they watched, they realized that she wasn't touching the ground. Her feet hovered just inches above the blood-stained floor, and her movements were unnaturally smooth, as though she were gliding through the air. The soldiers, already haunted by the trauma of battle, said nothing, too frightened to speak of what they had seen. But the sightings continued. Other patients began to report seeing a woman dressed in white, her face obscured by shadows, standing at the foot of their beds in the dead of night. She would linger for a moment, her sorrowful gaze fixed on them, and then she would vanish without a sound. As time went on, the stories spread. Nurses and doctors who had worked at the hospital began to speak of strange occurrences. Doors that opened and closed on their own, cold drafts that swept through the halls, even in the heat of summer, and the soft, distant sound of a woman's sobbing echoing through the empty corridors. It became clear that the woman in white had not left the hospital. She was still there, watching over the place where so many had suffered and died. Margaret herself had never seen the ghost, but she had interviewed many people who had. One account in particular stood out to her, a story from a group of Gettysburg College students who had come face to face with the woman in white during a late-night exploration of the old hospital building. It was early October, and the air was crisp with the first hints of winter. The students, 4 of them, all curious about the ghost stories that surrounded the campus, had decided to visit the old seminary building after dark. The building, now used for classrooms and offices, still retained much of its original structure, and the basement, where the makeshift hospital had once been, was said to be particularly haunted. Armed with flashlights and a mix of excitement and trepidation, the group made their way into the basement. The narrow stone corridors echoed with their footsteps as they descended into the heart of the building. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the basement, and the atmosphere became thick with a sense of foreboding. It felt like we were walking into a tomb, one of the students, Sarah, later told Margaret during an interview. The walls were damp, and the air was so still. It was like the building was holding its breath, waiting for something. As they explored the basement, they found themselves drawn to a small, dimly lit room at the far end of the hallway. The room had once served as the surgical ward during the battle, and it was here that the woman in white was said to have been seen most often. The students entered cautiously, their flashlights sweeping across the room's cold stone floor. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the silence was almost oppressive. That's when they heard it, the soft sound of weeping, faint at first, but unmistakable. It seemed to come from all around them, echoing off the walls, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of sorrow. At first, the students thought it was one of their friends playing a prank, but the look of fear in each other's eyes told them otherwise. They stood frozen, unsure of what to do, until Sarah, the bravest of the group, decided to follow the sound. Her flashlight flickered as she moved toward the far corner of the room, where the darkness seemed to gather more thickly. As she approached, the weeping grew louder, more distinct, and then, out of the shadows, she saw her, the woman in white. She was sitting on an old wooden chair, her head bowed, her long dark hair obscuring her face. Her white dress was torn and stained, and her shoulders shook with each quiet sob. For a moment, Sarah was too shocked to move. The figure seemed so real, so solid, that she thought for sure she had stumbled upon another person, someone lost or hurt. But as Sarah reached out to touch the woman's shoulder, something happened that made her blood run cold. The woman lifted her head. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes sunken and hollow. But it was her expression that terrified Sarah the most, a look of unimaginable sorrow and despair, as though she had witnessed every horror the world had to offer and had been crushed by the weight of it. The woman's lips moved, but no words came out. Instead, the weeping grew louder, filling the room, surrounding them in a cacophony of anguish. The other students backed away in terror, their flashlights flickering as they scrambled for the door. But Sarah couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the ghostly figure before her. Then, without warning, the woman in white stood up. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though she were being pulled by invisible strings. She glided toward Sarah, her feet never touching the ground, her hollow eyes fixed on the young woman's face. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. The ghostly figure reached out, her cold, translucent hand brushing against Sarah's arm. The touch was like ice, seeping into her skin, freezing her to the core. For what felt like an eternity, the woman in white stood there, her hand resting on Sarah's arm, her sorrowful eyes staring into hers. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished. The students fled the basement in a blind panic, their hearts racing as they burst out into the cool night air. They didn't stop running until they were halfway across campus, and even then, they could still hear the sound of weeping echoing in their ears. For days after the encounter, Sarah couldn't shake the image of the woman in white from her mind. The ghost's sorrow had left a mark on her, a deep, lingering sadness that she couldn't explain. She found herself waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the memory of those hollow eyes haunting her dreams. Margaret listened carefully as Sarah recounted the story, taking notes as the young woman spoke. It was clear to her that whatever Sarah and her friends had encountered in the basement of the old seminary, it was no ordinary ghost. The woman in white was a manifestation of the overwhelming grief that had saturated the battlefield, a spirit trapped in a cycle of endless sorrow, unable to move on from the horrors she had witnessed. Sarah wasn't the only one to have seen the woman in white. Over the years, there had been countless reports of similar encounters. Students, faculty, and even visitors to the campus had all spoken of seeing a woman dressed in white, her face obscured by shadows, her presence accompanied by an overwhelming sense of sadness. Some had seen her standing in the halls of the old hospital building. Others had heard her weeping in the dead of night. But the one thing all the stories had in common was the deep, unshakable feeling of sorrow that followed each encounter. Margaret paused for a moment, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug as she looked out the window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street outside. She turned back to me, her expression thoughtful. "There's something about Gettysburg," she said quietly. "Something about this place that holds on to the past. The dead don't rest easily here. And I think the woman in white is a part of that. She's a reminder of the suffering that happened here. A spirit who can't move on because she's still grieving for all the lives that were lost." I nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. Gettysburg was a place of history, but it was also a place of deep, lingering sorrow. The stories of ghosts and hauntings weren't just tales told to frighten tourists. They were echoes of a past too painful to forget. And as I left the cafe that evening, the sun dipping below the horizon and the shadows lengthening across the battlefield, I couldn't help but wonder if the woman in white was still out there, wandering the halls of the old seminary, her grief as endless as the history of the place she was bound to. The legend of the woman in white continues to this day, a spectral reminder of the human cost of war. Those who encounter her often speak of an overwhelming sense of sadness, as though they have touched something far deeper than just a ghost. Perhaps she is more than just an apparition. Perhaps she is a symbol of the grief that still lingers in Gettysburg, a sorrow that refuses to fade even after all these years. If you ever visit the old hospital grounds at night and you hear the soft sound of weeping in the distance, remember, the past is never truly gone. It lingers in the air, in the stones, and in the spirits of those who cannot let go. The woman in white is a part of that past, forever trapped in a place where the dead outnumber the living and where the echoes of war still haunt the land. And perhaps, if you're quiet enough, you might catch a glimpse of her too, a fleeting figure in the shadows, her sorrowful eyes watching over the place where so many lives were lost. The battlefield at Gettysburg is a vast, sprawling expanse of land that holds countless secrets. It was the site of one of the bloodiest and most significant battles of the American Civil War, a turning point in the conflict that claimed the lives of tens of thousands. But the battlefield is more than just a place of historical significance. It's a place where the past refuses to stay buried. When I heard about the lost Confederate soldier, I was intrigued. Gettysburg has no shortage of ghost stories, but there was something about this one that felt different. It wasn't just about the residual hauntings of soldiers reliving their final moments, nor was it about a tragic spirit trapped in a loop of grief. The lost Confederate soldier, as I would come to understand, was something far more personal. A soul caught in the liminal space between life and death, forever wandering in search of something he could never find. I first heard the story from Michael, a self-proclaimed paranormal enthusiast who had visited Gettysburg on a ghost tour. Michael was an avid ghost hunter, and he had been to numerous haunted locations across the country. But nothing, he claimed, had unsettled him quite like the encounter he had at Gettysburg. We met at a small bar near the battlefield one rainy evening, the low hum of conversation around us providing a strange comfort as he told me his tale. It was late October when Michael visited Gettysburg. The air was crisp, and the trees were ablaze with the fiery colors of autumn. Halloween was just around the corner, and the town was buzzing with activity. Tourists flocked to the battlefield, eager to experience the history and, perhaps, catch a glimpse of something otherworldly. Michael had joined a popular ghost tour that took visitors across the battlefield after dark. Led by a local guide, the tour promised to take them to some of the most haunted spots on the battlefield, recounting tales of ghostly sightings and strange occurrences along the way. Michael had been on similar tours before, but he had high hopes for Gettysburg. The battlefield's reputation as one of the most haunted places in America had drawn him in, and he was eager to see if the stories lived up to the hype. The tour began just as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the rolling hills and scattered monuments that marked the battlefield. As the group made their way along the narrow paths that wound through the fields, the guide told stories of ghostly soldiers seen marching through the mist, of strange sounds heard in the dead of night, and of the lingering sense of dread that seemed to hang over certain areas of the battlefield. But it wasn't until they reached Devil's Den that Michael began to feel truly uneasy. Devil's Den is one of the most infamous spots on the Gettysburg battlefield. It's a rocky outcropping that saw intense fighting on the second day of the battle. Confederate sharpshooters used the boulders as cover, picking off Union soldiers as they advanced. The fighting was brutal and bloody, and by the end of the day, the ground was littered with bodies. Today, the rocks still bear the scars of the battle, and it's said that the spirits of those who died there have never truly left. As the group stood among the massive boulders, listening to the guide recount the horrors that had taken place there, Michael felt a chill run down his spine. The air had grown colder, and the wind seemed to whisper through the trees, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. That's when he saw him. At first, Michael thought it was just another tourist, a man standing a short distance away, near the edge of the rocks, his figure partially obscured by the shadows. The man was wearing a wide-brimmed hat, the kind that Confederate soldiers often wore, and his posture was stiff and formal. Michael assumed he was part of the tour, someone who had wandered away from the group to take a closer look at the rocks. But there was something off about him. The man didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his head bowed slightly, as though he were lost in thought or perhaps in prayer. His uniform, now that Michael could see it more clearly, was old, tattered, and covered in dust. The dull gray fabric looked like it had been worn for far too long, the edges frayed and torn. Michael squinted, trying to get a better look, but before he could call out to the man, the figure vanished. Not in a blink, not in a puff of smoke, but slowly, as if the man had simply melted into the shadows, dissolving into the air like mist. Michael's heart raced as he turned to the person next to him, nudging them and pointing to where the figure had been. But when they looked, there was nothing there, just the cold, empty rocks, bathed in the fading light of dusk. He didn't say anything else. He wasn't even sure what he had just seen, and the last thing he wanted was to sound like he was jumping at shadows. But as the tour continued, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every now and then, out of the corner of his eye, he would catch a glimpse of the figure again, always at the edge of his vision, always disappearing the moment he tried to focus on him. The tour moved on, taking the group to other parts of the battlefield, but Michael's mind remained fixed on the man he had seen or thought he had seen at Devil's Den. As the night wore on, the tour guide's stories seemed to fade into the background, drowned out by the growing sense of unease that had settled over Michael like a heavy blanket. By the time the tour ended, Michael was convinced that something strange was happening. He had experienced his fair share of paranormal encounters in the past, but this felt different. This wasn't just a ghostly apparition flickering in and out of view. This was a presence. Something or someone was following him, and the more he tried to ignore it, the more insistent it became. After the tour, Michael decided to return to Devil's Den on his own. It was well past midnight by then, and the battlefield was completely deserted. The only sound was the rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional call of a distant owl. The darkness was thick, almost oppressive, but Michael felt drawn to the place, as if something was pulling him back. When he arrived at Devil's Den, the rocks loomed large and silent in the moonlight, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. Michael stood at the edge of the rocks, his breath visible in the cold night air, and waited. For a long time, nothing happened. The silence was deafening, and the stillness of the night made him feel like he was the only person left in the world. But just as he was about to turn and leave, he saw him again, the lost Confederate soldier. The figure was standing about 20 yards away, near a cluster of boulders. This time, there was no mistaking what he was seeing. The man was wearing a Confederate uniform, his hat pulled low over his eyes, his shoulders hunched as if weighed down by some invisible burden. His skin was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, and his clothes were ragged and torn, as though he had been wandering the battlefield for years. But the most unsettling thing was his face, or rather, the absence of it. The man's features were blurred, indistinct, like a painting that had been smudged beyond recognition. His eyes were hollow, dark pits, and his mouth hung slightly open as if he were trying to speak, but no sound came out. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step toward the figure, his feet crunching on the gravel beneath him. The soldier didn't move. He just stood there, staring at Michael with those empty, soulless eyes. For a long moment, they were locked in place, Michael too terrified to move, the soldier too spectral to advance. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the soldier raised his hand in a solemn salute. Michael's breath caught in his throat. The gesture was so simple, so human, and yet it sent a wave of cold fear crashing over him. The soldier's hand remained raised for what felt like an eternity, his eyes still fixed on Michael's, and then, just like before, he vanished. This time, there was no slow fading into the shadows. The soldier was simply gone, as if he had never been there at all. Michael left the battlefield that night shaken to his core. He had always been fascinated by the paranormal, but this experience was unlike anything he had ever encountered before. It wasn't just the sight of the ghost that had unsettled him. It was the deep, pervasive feeling of loss and despair that seemed to cling to the air around the soldier. It was as if the battlefield itself was mourning, and the lost Confederate soldier was a manifestation of that grief. In the weeks that followed, Michael couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. He scoured books and online forums, searching for any information he could find about the lost Confederate soldier. He learned that he wasn't the only one who had seen the figure over the years. There had been numerous reports of a Confederate soldier wandering the battlefield, his form flickering in and out of sight, always disappearing before anyone could get too close. Some believed that the soldier was the spirit of a man who had died during the battle, his body never recovered, his soul forever searching for peace. Others speculated that he was a symbol of the countless lives lost at Gettysburg, a ghostly reminder of the horrors of war and the men who never returned home. But no matter how much Michael read, he couldn't find any definitive answers. The lost Confederate soldier remained an enigma, a ghost trapped in a place where time itself seemed to stand still. It was almost a year later when Michael returned to Gettysburg. He had spent months trying to forget the encounter, but something kept drawing him back. He needed closure, needed to know if the soldier was still there, still wandering the battlefield in search of something that could never be found. This time, Michael brought a camera with him. He wasn't a skeptic. He had seen the ghost with his own eyes, but he wanted to capture proof, something tangible that he could hold on to. He arrived at the battlefield just as the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink, the air heavy with the scent of autumn leaves. Once again, he made his way to Devil's Den. The rocks were as imposing as ever, casting long shadows across the ground as the last light of day faded into dusk. Michael stood at the edge of the rocks, his camera in hand, and waited. For a long time, nothing happened. The battlefield was silent, save for the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. Michael began to wonder if the soldier would appear at all, if perhaps he had moved on, finally finding the peace he had been searching for. But just as he was about to leave, he saw him. The lost Confederate soldier was standing in the same spot as before, his figure barely visible in the dim light. This time, Michael didn't hesitate. He raised his camera and snapped a photo, the flash briefly illuminating the soldier's face. But when he looked at the screen, there was nothing there. No soldier, no figure, just the empty rocks bathed in the fading light of dusk. Michael looked up, and the soldier was gone. Michael left Gettysburg that night without the proof he had hoped for, but he didn't leave empty-handed. He had seen the lost Confederate soldier twice now, and he knew in his heart that the ghost was real. The battlefield was a place where the past and present blurred, where the dead still walked among the living, their spirits bound to the land that had claimed them. The lost Confederate soldier, Michael realized, wasn't just a ghost, he was a symbol. A reminder of the countless men who had fought and died at Gettysburg, their lives cut short by the horrors of war. His salute was a gesture of respect, not just for Michael, but for all those who had come before him, for all those who would continue to walk the battlefield in search of the past. To this day, visitors to Gettysburg still report sightings of the lost Confederate soldier. Some say he appears in the early morning mist. Others claim to have seen him wandering the battlefield at dusk. But no matter when or where he is seen, one thing is certain: his presence lingers, a spectral reminder of a time when brother fought against brother, and the land was soaked in blood. If you ever find yourself at Gettysburg, standing among the rocks of Devil's Den, keep your eyes open. You might just catch a glimpse of him, a lonely figure in a tattered uniform, forever lost in the shadows of history. And if you do, remember to salute him. He's earned it. The early morning light was soft and golden, filtering through the trees that lined the battlefield at Gettysburg. It was a peaceful sight now, but over 160 years ago, these same fields were filled with the smoke of gunfire, the cries of the wounded, and the chaos of war. This place, hallowed by the blood of thousands, has never fully returned to peace. The restless dead are said to still wander the fields and hills, their spectral forms trapped in a never-ending battle. But of all the ghost stories that have emerged from Gettysburg, one has always stood out to me, haunting, yet profoundly sad. It's the tale of the ghostly drummer boy, a spirit not of a hardened soldier, but of a child whose life was cut tragically short by war. I first heard the story from a battlefield guide named Jack, a grizzled man in his late 50s with sharp eyes that hinted at many years spent exploring every inch of the Gettysburg landscape. Jack had been giving tours at Gettysburg for nearly 2 decades, and during that time, he had heard and experienced more than his fair share of ghost stories. But when he told me about the drummer boy, his voice took on a different tone, quieter, more somber. This was a story that weighed heavily on him, one that didn't just frighten him, but made him think deeply about the toll war takes on the innocent. Jack and I had met on a cold November afternoon, the kind where the chill in the air feels like it seeps into your bones. We were standing near Little Round Top, one of the key locations during the battle. As we walked the winding paths that crisscrossed the hill, Jack began to tell me the story of the drummer boy. During the Civil War, it wasn't uncommon for young boys to join the ranks of soldiers not as fighters, but as musicians. Drummer boys played a vital role in the battlefield, using their drums to communicate orders and boost the morale of the troops. These boys, some as young as 12, were thrust into the heart of battle, surrounded by the horrors of war, long before they were old enough to truly understand what it all meant. According to Jack, the drummer boy of Gettysburg was one of these unfortunate souls. His name was William, though his full identity has been lost to history. William was just 13 years old when he joined the Union Army, his small frame and youthful face a sharp contrast to the grizzled, battle-hardened men around him. He wasn't there to fight, he was there to drum, to keep the beat steady as the soldiers marched into the jaws of death. William had been with the Army for only a few months when the Battle of Gettysburg began. He was eager, proud to serve, and determined to prove himself, despite his young age. The sound of his drum echoed across the battlefield as the Union soldiers prepared for battle, a rhythmic beat that seemed to cut through the chaos and fear that hung heavy in the air. But the battle that raged over those 3 days in July was unlike anything William or anyone else had ever seen. The fields were soon filled with the dead and dying, and the once steady beat of William's drum was drowned out by the roar of cannons and the screams of men. As the fighting grew fiercer, William found himself separated from the rest of his unit, lost in the chaos and carnage of the battlefield. And then, like so many others, he disappeared. His body was never found. Some say he was killed by a stray bullet. Others believe he was trampled in the chaos of battle, and still others think he may have run away, overwhelmed by the horror of what he had witnessed. But whatever the truth, William was never seen again, at least, not in the world of the living. The first sighting of the drummer boy's ghost was reported not long after the battle ended. Soldiers still stationed at Gettysburg, recovering from their wounds or helping to bury the dead, began to speak of hearing the faint sound of drumming late at night. At first, they thought it was a trick of the wind or the distant echo of another regiment. But as the nights wore on, the drumming became more persistent. It was always the same, a soft, rhythmic beat, almost like a heartbeat, carrying on the wind. The sound seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once, drifting through the darkened fields and across the hills. The soldiers who heard it reported feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness, as though the drumming wasn't just a call to battle, but a lament for something lost. Then came the sightings. One night, a Union soldier stationed near the peach orchard, a location that had seen some of the most brutal fighting, claimed to have seen a boy walking across the field. The boy was small, barely more than a silhouette in the moonlight, but the soldier could clearly see the drum strapped to his chest. The boy walked slowly, his head bowed, his hands moving in rhythm as he played his drum. The soldier called out to the boy, but he didn't respond. He just kept walking, his figure fading into the mist that clung to the ground like a shroud. The next morning, the soldier told his comrades what he had seen, but they laughed it off, telling him it was just his imagination, a trick of the moonlight and the fog. But the sightings continued. Over the years, more and more people reported seeing the ghostly figure of the drummer boy. He was always described the same way, young, with a sad, distant expression, and a drum that he played softly as he walked the battlefield. The sightings weren't limited to soldiers either. Tourists, historians, even locals who lived near the battlefield all claimed to have seen the boy, always at dusk or just before dawn, when the light was soft and the air was still. Jack had been giving tours at Gettysburg for years before he had his own encounter with the drummer boy. It was late September and the tourist season was winding down. Most of the visitors had gone home and the battlefield was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Jack was leading a small group on a dusk tour, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the fields. They had just finished visiting the wheat field, another site of brutal fighting, and were making their way toward the peach orchard when Jack heard it. At first, it was so faint he thought he was imagining it a soft, steady tapping, like someone lightly beating a drum. He paused, listening intently, but the sound disappeared. Jack shrugged it off and continued with the tour, but a few minutes later, the drumming returned, louder this time. The rest of the group heard it too, their faces turning pale as they looked around, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. The battlefield was empty, the only other sound the occasional whisper of the wind through the trees. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Jack saw him. The boy was standing at the edge of the field, just beyond a line of trees, his small figure barely visible in the fading light. He was dressed in the uniform of a Union drummer boy, his cap pulled low over his eyes, and his drum hanging loosely from his shoulders. Jack froze, his heart racing in his chest. The rest of the group hadn't seen the boy yet. They were still looking around, trying to locate the source of the drumming, but Jack couldn't take his eyes off him. For a moment, the boy just stood there, his hands still moving as he played his drum. But then, slowly, he began to walk. He moved with an eerie, dreamlike quality, his feet barely seeming to touch the ground as he made his way across the field. Jack wanted to call out to him, to ask him who he was, but the words caught in his throat. There was something deeply unsettling about the boy's presence, something that went beyond the normal fear of encountering a ghost. As the boy walked, the drumming grew louder, filling the air with its rhythmic beat. The rest of the group had finally noticed him, and a murmur of fear rippled through them. One of the tourists took a step forward, as if to follow the boy, but Jack stopped him. "No," Jack said quietly. "Let him go." The boy didn't look back, he just kept walking, his figure growing smaller and smaller as he disappeared into the mist that had begun to settle over the battlefield. When the drumming finally stopped, the group stood in stunned silence, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Jack, for his part, was shaken. He had heard the stories of the drummer boy for years, but seeing him in person was something else entirely. There was a sadness that lingered in the air after the boy disappeared, a heaviness that pressed down on Jack's chest like a weight. After that night, Jack began to research the drummer boy in earnest. He spoke to historians, read through old records, and interviewed others who had claimed to see the boy. What he found was a pattern. Every sighting of the drummer boy was accompanied by the same feeling of deep, unshakable sorrow. It was as though the boy's spirit carried with it all the pain and suffering of the battlefield, a reminder of the innocence lost in the chaos of war. Some believed that the boy was still searching for his unit, lost and alone in the afterlife, just as he had been in life. Others thought that he was trying to fulfill his duty, drumming the beat of war even in death, forever bound to the battlefield that had claimed him. But no matter the theory, one thing was clear: the drummer boy was not at peace. Jack had one final encounter with the drummer boy before he retired from giving tours. It was early one morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise, and the battlefield was shrouded in mist. Jack was walking along the ridge near Little Round Top when he heard it again, the soft, steady beat of the drum. This time, Jack didn't turn to look for the boy. He knew better. Instead, he stood still, listening to the sound as it drifted through the mist, growing fainter and fainter with each passing moment. And then, just as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, the drumming stopped. Jack never heard it again. The story of the drummer boy continues to be one of the most well-known ghost stories of Gettysburg. Visitors to the battlefield still report hearing the faint sound of drumming, especially in the early morning hours or just before dusk. Some have even claimed to see the boy himself, his small figure walking slowly across the fields, his hands never stopping their rhythmic beat. But no matter how many times he is seen or heard, the drummer boy remains a mystery. His name, his fate, even the exact spot where he died, all of it has been lost to time. What remains is his ghost, forever bound to the battlefield, a haunting reminder of the innocence lost in the violence of war. If you ever visit Gettysburg and find yourself alone on the battlefield at dusk, listen closely. You might just hear the soft, steady beat of a drum carried on the wind. And if you're lucky, or perhaps unlucky, you might catch a glimpse of the drummer boy himself, still marching to a beat that only he can hear. But if you do see him, don't try to follow. Let him go. His march is one that cannot be interrupted. A ghostly journey through a battlefield where the echoes of war still linger. The drummer boy is lost, and he may never find his way home. But his story, like so many others at Gettysburg, will never be forgotten. The stories of Gettysburg are as vast and haunting as the battlefield itself. From the ghostly soldiers who marched through the mist to the sorrowful woman in white, these apparitions are more than just tales told to frighten tourists. They are echoes of a past too painful to be forgotten. The land, soaked in blood and grief, seems to hold on to the spirits of those who perished there, keeping them tethered to the place where they fought and died. Even now, over a century and a half later, the ghosts of Gettysburg continue to remind us of the horrors of war and the heavy toll it takes on both the living and the dead. For those who visit the battlefield, especially after dark, the sense of being watched, of not being alone, is a common experience. And while some may scoff at the idea of ghosts, those who have walked the fields and heard the whispers in the wind know better. Perhaps the spirits of Gettysburg will never rest. Perhaps they are destined to walk the battlefield for all eternity, their cries for peace and redemption lost in the fog of time. Or perhaps they are waiting for what no one can say. But one thing is certain: Gettysburg is more than just a place of historical significance. It is a place where the past still lives, where the dead refuse to be forgotten, and where the shadows of war still linger long after the cannons have fallen silent. If you ever find yourself standing on those hallowed grounds and you feel a chill in the air or see a figure moving in the mist, remember you are not alone. The ghosts of Gettysburg are always watching.